Welcome! It's officially been 2 months since the release of Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4, and the fandom still hasn't fully recovered from the Hiroshima-level truth bombs dropped in these chapters. Seriously, everything we thought we knew about these games turned out to be wrong, and so many extremely popular and well-accepted fan theories were killed off in one fell swoop. Rest in peace, Woody Theory and Chris Knight Theory, you will be missed. But, while many Deltarune theories were reduced to rubble, like a phoenix rising from the ashes of its predecessor, several newer and better theories have arisen, most of which revolve around the Knight's identity. As we all know, in Chapter 3, spoilers for Chapter 3, though I don't know why you would click on this video if you haven't played it, but in Chapter 3, we finally meet the Roaring Knight after 7 years of build-up, and promptly put that bitch in its place. But that's not all. We also get some much-needed character development for Noelle's missing sister Des, as well as some information on what might have happened to her. And most people at this point have concluded that Des is the Knight. The logistics of how this works seems to differ depending on who you're talking to, but generally people think that Des died and the Knight is her brought back to life or some shit. And I can certainly understand this perspective. I mean, I think it's only natural to come to that conclusion, especially after seeing the Knight's antlers and the baseball bat looking weapon. And of course, the thought did cross my mind when I first played the game. But I don't personally think Des is the Knight. I think she's just a red herring. And in this video, I'm gonna explain why. And I'm also gonna explain why the red herring argument isn't stupid, because I've seen a lot of people saying it's stupid and overthinking things. It's not stupid. Y'all are just underthinking things. I just want to make it clear that this video is not about debunking Des Knight or showing why it's impossible, because I do genuinely think it is possible. I'm sort of approaching it like I'm a defense attorney and my client is Des. I'm gonna explain the evidence against Des as laid out by the prosecution, then I'm gonna poke holes in that theory, show why it's not as conclusive as people make it out to be, introduce some reasonable doubt into the equation, then I'll present my own evidence proving my client's innocence. And finally, I'll explain why Des is most likely a red herring, and why that's totally in line for Toby's writing style to do this. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, then you know that I kinda think Rudy is the Knight, but you don't really have to agree with that theory or even watch that video to understand this video. I'm just being upfront with where I stand on this issue and any potential biases I might have. But with all that out of the way, let's lay out the major pieces of evidence in support of the Des Knight theory, and then I'll explain some problems I have with all of them. These are, I guess, the most commonly cited pieces of evidence I've been able to find online. I'm obviously not going to be able to go over every single unique argument ever used in existence to support the Des Knight theory, but if you really feel like PP-Poo-Poo-123's Reddit post with 3 upvotes on it brings up some new and novel evidence that completely destroys my case, feel free to let me know about it in the comments below and I'll try to respond to you. Anyway, these are the main pieces of evidence people cite in support of the Des Knight theory. 1. The Knight has antlers. 2. The Knight is left-handed. 3. The Knight has an undead appearance. 4. Des knows the shelter code. 5. The Mother 3 connection. 6. The silent guitar sound. 7. The Knight's weapon looks like a baseball bat. And finally, 8. The Knight turns into a baseball. Let's start with Exhibit 1, the Knight has antlers. I actually agree with this statement. The Knight definitely has antlers. I mean, I guess there's always the possibility that the antlers are part of their helmet or some shit, and the only thing that makes me think that could be the case is when we make Chris think of the Knight in Chapter 4, we do see like a vision of the Knight slowly taking off their helmet, which would be kind of hard to do logistically if their antlers are like poking out of their helmet. Like, how would that work exactly? But I can suspend my disbelief about that. It is only a vision, and we don't really know how the Knight's armor works or what taking off their helmet would look like. I mean, for all we know, it could work like the fucking helmet in the Iron Man suit, you know what I mean? So I'm just gonna assume that the Knight does have antlers and that it is possible for them to take off their helmet easily. Because I feel like that would be a really lame writing decision if this was like a random, meaningless detail that's only there to mislead the audience. Obviously, the Knight having antlers doesn't just implicate Des, it implicates the entire Holiday family since they all have antlers. Though obviously people have brought up more evidence that points to Des specifically, so let's talk about that evidence. Let's move on to Exhibit 2, the Knight is left-handed, just like Des. This is just objectively false. I mean, yes, Des is left-handed if we go off of her mouse being on the left side of her desk, that would indicate she's left-handed, but there's absolutely no evidence that the knight is left-handed. That's just not true. And I know some of you in the comments are going to accuse me of nitpicking, since this point has largely been debunked by the fandom, but I still see people on Reddit and YouTube comment sections making this argument, so I feel like I have to correct this misinformation. And I admit, I'm guilty of spreading this misinformation myself. Since in my Rudy video, I bring up the knight being left-handed as like evidence that Des could be the knight. That's just not true. There is no evidence that the knight is left-handed. We see them swing their sword with their right hand all the time, which would actually tend to indicate they're right-handed, since they swing all of their powerful haymakers with their right hand, but they also default to holding their sword with their left hand, so their handedness is left pretty ambiguous. They could be left-handed, they could be right-handed, they could be ambidextrous for all we know. Either way, this evidence is completely bullshit. So let's move on to Exhibit 3. The knight has an undead appearance. Many people have noticed that the knight has a very skeletal appearance. Their torso is sunken in, making their ribcage and hip bones look very pronounced. Their waist is non-existent, consisting of just their spine. And the rest of their joints and edges are very jagged, showing they have very little meat on their bones. They also have the ability to unhinge their jaw and open up what looks like their ribcage, and this reveals that their chest cavity is completely empty, apart from this glowing white orb inside. Overall, these skeletal features resemble that of a zombie or a decomposing corpse, indicating that the knight might be undead. And since Des is missing, the theory goes that she died and someone reanimated her corpse and made her the Roaring Knight. As for how she was reanimated, some people think she was injected with determination and is an amalgamate. Other people think that the knight is a vessel and Des's dust was like scattered on it and she's possessing the vessel that way. Other people think it's something completely different. It really just depends on who you're talking to. You know, it's all very speculative at this point. But regardless of how this hypothetical reanimation process would work, I just don't really agree that the knight looks undead. Since all of these skeletal features are clearly there to make the knight look like a titan, not a zombie. The sharp corners, the all-black body, the white opening into their face, they're obviously supposed to look like a titan, no? Now, what these visual similarities are supposed to imply is kind of left ambiguous. It could be that the knight draws their power from the same source as the titans, hence why they look like each other. But regardless, I just have to heavily disagree with the notion that the knight looks undead. That's just a gigantic stretch, especially if we have to ignore all of the obvious similarities between the knights and the titans to come to the conclusion that the knight is undead. Like, the knight is just not a zombie, they're just a skinny legend, okay guys? And I'm sorry, I just have to disagree with the whole discourse surrounding the knight's ribcage. It looks like their ribcage is opening up in this scene, but you can see from a different angle that this is not their ribcage. It's some sort of like weird spiral thing. So I just don't see any visual similarities between knights and zombies. They're just supposed to look like a titan. Now, there's one more thing I want to address about the knight's appearance, because a common counter-argument against non-Des Knight theories is that, oh, if, say, Carol is the knight, why does she look like that? Why does the knight's silhouette look nothing like Carol's? Why is she significantly bigger than normal? And maybe this can be explained by the knight's similarities to the titans, because if the knight draws their power from the same source as the titans, maybe they go through this like Power Rangers style transformation and it makes them look different from normal. I'm just spitballing here. I could be completely wrong, but I guess that's my counter argument to that counter argument. Okay, things are starting to get confusing here, so let's just move on to the next exhibit. Exhibit 4. Des knows the shelter code. So it's revealed in chapter 4 that one of the shelter codes is written in Des's guitar. And this code is 1225, which is Christmas's date. And since Christmas is a holiday in December, you could argue that this code is a reference to December holiday's name. So obviously, finding a shelter code in one of Des's personal items and having that shelter code be based on her name is pretty suspicious and would imply that Des is the knight. It'd be like if we found a laptop in the game that had "belongs to the knight, please don't steal" written on it, and the password to the laptop was December holiday's full legal name and social security number. Like, I wonder who the knight is. But let me present a different perspective to all this. Firstly, it's possible that Des was just investigating the bunker before her disappearance, and she figured out one of the shelter codes and she wrote it down in her guitar to remember it. Like maybe she was snooping through her parents' things and she found the shelter code. Since for some reason, Carol just keeps all of her sensitive documents in her house, maybe Des just stumbled upon the shelter code and wrote it down. It's even possible that Des dug too deep and she knew too much and that's why she disappeared. There's also the possibility that Des had nothing to do with this code at all and it belongs to Carol. For all we know, Carol created the code after Des's disappearance, and she just decided to hide it in Des's guitar, since no one goes into her room anyway and no one would think to look in the guitar, so it makes for a good hiding place. As for why the code is 1225 specifically, it could just be a reference to Christmas in general, since Carol is obsessed with Christmas and her family has that whole Christmas theme to it. And even if the code is a direct reference to December holiday's name, that doesn't mean December holiday is the night. Maybe Carol chose that code to reference the daughter she's desperately trying to find. There is a theory that Carol is helping the night because she's trying to find Des. And since it seems like the shelter used to have a legitimate purpose and Carol started using it for shady reasons when she started working for the night, it's possible that when she was creating the code for the shelter, she just decided to reference her daughter because that's her whole motivation, to find Des. You know what I mean? I hope I'm making sense here. This is what happens when I go off my script. I'm not good at these off-the-cuff comments. Anyway, just to clarify what I'm trying to say here, because I am rambling a bit. The shelter code being in Des's guitar, and the shelter code being a reference to Des's name, does not prove Des is the knight for two reasons. One, she could have just been investigating the shelter before her disappearance, and she found out one of the shelter codes and just wrote it in her guitar. And two, it's possible that this is just Carol's code and Carol decided to hide the code in Des's guitar since it's a good hiding place. And the reason why the code is 1222 is because Carol likes Christmas and also might have been referencing her missing daughter that she's trying to find desperately. Basically, there are many alternate explanations for why the code was in Des's guitar, other than Des being the knight. So my client is innocent! Innocent, I tell you! Alright, let's move on to Exhibit 5, the Mother 3 connection. This section is gonna spoil a pretty major plot twist for Mother 3, so if you haven't played the game, I recommend you just skip this section. It's not really that important to my overarching thesis, it's just kind of a cool connection people have noticed. Also, if you haven't played the game, play it, it's peak. So, it's well known that Toby Fox is a huge fan of the Mother series, and it inspired many aspects of Undertale and Deltarune. And many people have speculated that one of the inspirations for the Roaring Knight character came from one of Mother 3's main antagonists, the Masked Man. The Masked Man is a mysterious character that shows up in the middle of Mother 3. He, along with the game's main character Lucas, are the only two people capable of pulling the 7 strings. And without getting too much into the game's lore, essentially, if an evil person pulls out all of the 7 strings, it'll cause the end of the world. Are we starting to see the similarities here? Both the Masked Man and the Roaring Knight are anonymous characters who want to either poke or pull something out of the earth to cause the end of the world. But those might not be the only similarities between the Masked Man and the Roaring Knight. You see, the Masked Man is later revealed to be the main character Lucas's missing brother, Klaus. Basically, Klaus died at the beginning of the game, and no one knew that he died, so people just thought he was missing, and his corpse was reanimated by the game's main antagonist to become the Masked Man. So yeah, since Deltarune and Mother 3 have very similar antagonists, and both games feature a main character who has a missing sibling, it's very possible that Des is the Knight, purely because she was inspired by Klaus/the Masked Man. And look, as a Des Knight skeptic, I agree that Des is obviously inspired by Klaus from Mother 3, and the Knight was also probably loosely inspired by the Masked Man. The only counter-argument I have to all this is maybe Toby doesn't want to blatantly rip off the Mother series all the time. Maybe he even originally imagined the Knight being Des, but then changed his mind and decided to make it someone else. We really don't know. I certainly don't think some superficial similarities between the Roaring Knight and the Masked Man mean they're gonna be identical characters in every way. Maybe Toby just disliked the mystique of the Masked Man, but wanted to make the knight someone other than a main character's missing sister. And even if Klaus did partially inspire Des, it could have been in a separate way from the Masked Man. Like maybe he just liked Lucas's arc with, his missing brother and wanted to replicate that arc in Noelle with Des. You know what I mean? We just don't really know. And I feel like this connection is pretty weak. And with that, let's move on to Exhibit 6, the silent guitar sound. So in Chapter 4, if you backtrack after beating the game's main boss, you'll encounter this unknown person who blocks your way. It seems like the way is blocked. You put out your hand, and just out of view, just perfectly out of view, another hand pressed against yours and pushed you back. Now, of course, many people have speculated that this unknown person is the knight, for obvious reasons. But that's not the only interesting thing about this NPC, because if you look at the code associated with this scene, you'll see that a guitar noise was supposed to play at the end of the dialogue. But the volume of the sound is set to 0, making it inaudible. If you turn the volume back up, you'll hear one of Des's guitar sounds. So, this is another piece of evidence that seems to point to Des being the knight. But hold on, let's think about this for a second. You're telling me that the knight just randomly decided to bring Des's guitar into a dark world, and the only thing they do with it is strum it if Chris backtracks too far? Like, I don't understand. Plus, what if this person just isn't the knight? I mean, where's the evidence that it's the knight? It could literally be anyone, Why would the knight be here? In my personal opinion, I think this person is Des, who is not the knight in this situation. You're probably wondering how Des got into a dark world, and I don't honestly know how this works, but maybe what happened to Des is similar to what happened to Gaster. Like maybe she was shattered across time and space and became this sort of incorporeal being that can show up at any place and any time. It doesn't really explain how she's able to make the guitar noise, but Gaster does make that weird noise when he disappears, so I'm sure it's possible somehow. Maybe the confusing nature of this scene is what ultimately led to this sound being removed, I'm not really sure. But regardless, I don't think this proves that Des is the knight, since this person could just not be the knight at all. Okay, let's move on to the next piece of evidence. Exhibit 7. The knight's weapon looks like a baseball bat. This is probably the strongest piece of evidence that Des is the knight, because there's no doubt that when the knight first pulls out their weapon, it does look like a baseball bat. And since Des is known to like baseball and wield bats, this would obviously implicate Des. I mean, we find the wiffle bat in her room. Noelle tells a story of Des playfully hitting Chris over the head with a wiffle bat. There's the Raise Up Your Bat song, which seems to have been written by Des, or at least told from the perspective of Des. And it talks about raising up your bat to face the fright, let's knock 'em dead into the night, all seemingly alluding to the idea of Des becoming the knight and using a baseball as a weapon. Raise Up Your Bats also has Lost Girl's theme in it, which is a theme associated with Des. Plus, I think in Noelle's room in the second Dark World, the moon is a baseball, and Noelle says something to the effect of, I wish Des could see this. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is Des clearly likes baseball a lot. And the fact that the knight seemingly wields a baseball bat would support the idea that Des is the knight. Now, I have a couple of problems with this evidence. For one, is Des the only person in town allowed to like baseball? Couldn't she have gotten her interest in baseball from, I don't know, Rudy or something? Maybe he used to play baseball in his younger years. And when we finally see the inside of Carol's room, we're gonna see all this baseball memorabilia and old trophies from his days as an athlete. I'm just writing fanfiction at this point, but it is a possibility. It might be a little cheap, but, it is a possibility that it's not Des and just someone else in her family who likes baseball. But I think the main problem I have with this baseball bat argument is the fact that the knight's weapon is clearly a sword, not a bat. It only looks like a bat for a couple of seconds, but once the knight starts swinging it around, it clearly looks like a sword. And the prophecy confirms that the Roaring Knight is wielding a blackened blade, not a bat. So it's 100% confirmed to be a sword. Why does it look like a bat that one time? I have no fucking idea. Everything about this sword's appearance is so inconsistent and confusing because most of the time it looks like a sword, but sometimes it looks like a bat. And other times, it looks like a sword, but the guard is missing and the end of the weapon looks like the end of a bat. And yet, other times, the end of the sword doesn't look like the end of a bat, but the guard is still missing. It's all very confusing. I feel like the sword was animated in a way to imply that its form isn't strictly defined, that the knight has the ability to warp and change its appearance. But regardless, I feel like there's still far more evidence that it's a sword, specifically the one in Carol's bedroom, than there is evidence that it's a bat. Especially since a shard breaks off of it, which would be very hard to do if it's a bat. And look, I get the argument. The fact that the weapon looks like a bat at any time is clearly meant to reference Dess's iconography. But I'm sorry, we can't just ignore all of the times it clearly looks like a sword, and pay attention to the one time it looks like a bat to implicate Dess. If the weapon looking like a bat supports Dess Knight, then the weapon looking like a sword supports Carol Knight, and the weapon looks like a sword 90% of the time. So what does that say about Dess Knight? Now, me personally, I feel like this whole weapons analysis thing is a dead end, since there's no consistency in the weapon's appearance. I just don't think there are any conclusions we can reasonably draw from the knight's weapon since its appearance and properties are so ambiguous. And I know what some of you are saying. Are you seriously arguing that the baseball bat is a random detail or red herring and not an obvious hint that Dess is the knight? And my answer to that question is another question. Are you arguing that the black katana in Carol's bedroom is just a random detail or red herring and not an obvious hint that Carol is the knight? Or at least has possession of the knight's weapon? I'm just saying, if you believe the katana is a red herring, then you should also believe that the bat could be a red herring. Oh, and in regards to the Raise Up Your Bat song, since there are no direct confessions or allusions to Dess being the knight, I would submit to the jury that this song simply strengthens Dess's connection to baseball rather than to the knight itself. Either way, that's all I have to say about the baseball bat. So let's move on to the final exhibit, Exhibit 8. The knight turns into a baseball. So the knight has the ability to transform into this flying ball thing, which does resemble a baseball, allegedly, in some people's opinions. And as I just established earlier, this has a very strong connection to baseball. Therefore, Dess Knight confirmed. Okay, let's talk about this ball thing for a second, because I feel like its resemblance to a baseball is highly debatable. Like, aren't baseballs supposed to be one solid color with some fine stitching in another color? This quote-unquote baseball is two colors, one on the top and bottom and one in the middle, and the baseball doesn't have any stitching on the sides either. So I wouldn't say this is very baseball-like. And I'm sure someone just piped up in the comments and is like, actually, my baseball looks like that. Congratulations, you have an unusual looking baseball. You know, there's an exception to every rule, and I'm sure you're the exception. But the traditional, stereotypical baseball doesn't look like that. And I feel like if Toby was trying to make an intentional reference to baseball, he would just draw it like an actual baseball. I guess it's possible he drew it that way to make it less on the nose, but more likely he drew it that way to make it look like the ball was visually spinning. Since it is kind of difficult to animate a spinning ball that's one solid color using pixel art, you would have to have parts of it that are a different color that are, moving, right? And that's all there could be to this ball. I certainly wouldn't say it's objectively 100% confirmed to be a baseball, but that's just my opinion. I agree that when it comes to things resembling other things, it is subjective, and it is going to be colored by people's biases for certain theories. And I am biased against the Dess Knight theory, so it might just be my brain playing tricks on me and it really is a baseball. But I feel like I've shown why there's at least some reasonable doubt regarding this baseball claim. Okay, so those are the major pieces of evidence used to support the Dess Knight theory. And just to recap the counter-arguments I gave to each piece of evidence: 1. The knight having antlers indicates that the knight is a member of the Holiday family, not that the knight is Dess specifically. 2. The knight isn't left-handed like Dess, that's just false. 3. The knight doesn't look undead, they look like a titan. 4. Dess knowing the shelter code doesn't mean she's a knight. It could mean that she was just investigating the shelter before her disappearance, or it could mean that Carol created the code after her disappearance and just hid the code in her guitar since no one goes into her room or uses any of her items anymore. 5. The masked man from Mother 3 being an inspiration for the Roaring Knight doesn't mean they're gonna be identical characters in every way. And Dess having superficial similarities to Klaus does not mean she's gonna be the Roaring Knight either. 6. The silent guitar sound could imply that Des, or some remnant of her, was in a dark world, but it doesn't mean she's also the knight. They could be separate entities still. 7. The appearance of the knight's weapon is too inconsistent to meaningfully analyze it, but even if I accept that it looked like a bat for a few seconds, it looks like a sword 90% of the time, which supports Carol Knight more than it supports Des Knight. And finally, 8. Whether the ball the knight turns into looks like a baseball or not is highly subjective, but I don't personally think it looks like a baseball at all. Those are my counter-arguments in a nutshell, and if you have any counter-arguments to that, make sure to leave them in the comments below, and I'll give my counter-arguments. With that being said, I think I've shown why the evidence against Des isn't as conclusive as people claim it to be. And I get that when it comes to circumstantial cases like Des Knight, you can't really examine each piece of evidence individually, because it's the coalescing of many pieces of circumstantial evidence that makes the theory seem more likely, as opposed to a series of coincidences. So we do have to consider all of the evidence as a whole in order to really judge the theory's strength. But it is also true that if you're able to undermine every single piece of circumstantial evidence in a purely circumstantial case, it does undermine the case's overall strength. And I think I've successfully done that with the Des Knight theory. Now that I've undermined the prosecution's case, I'd like to present my own evidence that proves my client's innocence. For one, the whole point of Des's character is that we need to find her, right? The Spamton sweepstakes makes this point very clear. So if we're supposed to find Des, her being the knight kinda defeats the purpose of that search. Like, guys, look, I found her. Looks like our work here is done. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Especially since Des is supposed to be trapped in the code. How would that work if she's also the knight? And it's not like this is a past tense thing. The unused text seems to imply that she's still trapped in the code, like right now. Just listen to it. It's nothing but pitch black silence, except for this noise, this scratching noise I hear sometimes. This sounds crazy, but even though no one can hear me, when I hear that noise, I feel like someone's listening. Anyone, if you're there, thank you. Like, this is clearly her talking to us, the data miners who are looking through the game's files and reading this text. She's thanking us for listening. And I guess it's also implied that the scratching noise is caused by us looking through the code, but that's besides the point. It seems like Des is trapped in the code right now, so how can she also be the knight at the same time? I've heard some people say that she isn't literally trapped in the code, that she's instead trapped within her own mind and some other evil force is controlling her body as the knight. And these unused lines of dialogue are Des talking to herself while she's trapped in her mind prison. I guess our goal is to save her from this predicament by appealing to her humanity and reminding her of who she once was. This is how we'll bring Des back. But this still doesn't explain what the Spamton sweepstakes means by find her. In this situation, we're clearly trying to save Des from herself, no? So shouldn't the Spamton sweepstakes be telling us to help her or save her? Insert FNAF reference joke here. But seriously, why is the Lost Girl MIDI called Find Her? That's a very specific request that would usually entail looking for someone who's being physically kept in an unknown location that we need to find. Not that we need to help them metaphorically find themselves by appealing to their humanity. But that's just my take on the situation. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing. I just think that Des is fulfilling a different narrative role than the knight, as a sort of MacGuffin type character or a motivation for other characters' actions, as opposed to an antagonist. Another problem I have with the Des Knight theory is, if Des is the knight, why would Carol work for her? Because it seems like Carol is working with the knight to open dark worlds to find Des. And it's like, why would she do that if the knight is literally Des? Like, mission success, you found your daughter, you don't need to do all of this. And look, I know there are a lot of counter-arguments to this point. How do we know Carol is working for the knight? How do we know that Carol is doing this to find Des? Let me address those concerns. Firstly, how do we know Carol is working for the knight? To show why this is the case, I have to first prove why Chris is working for the knight. When we fight the knight at the end of chapter 3, it's clear that Chris does not want us to win. They refuse to give us any information about the knight when we check them. When we hold our breath and nothing happens, Chris smiles since they know that we won't get any additional speed boost in the fight. Chris refuses to hit the knight with their full power unless Susie and Rousey are down, and the knight also refuses to hit Chris with their full power, since they won't drop Chris's health to negative 999 like they will with Susie and Rousey. If he managed to no-hit the knight, Chris will cough and signal to the knight to end their fight since they're getting their asses beat. And after the knight strikes down Susie and Rousey, the knight will make Chris kneel with their sword, and Chris will play dead. So yeah, it's clear that Chris is working for the knight. Now, why is this relevant to Carol? Well, in Chapter 4, we can overhear Chris talking to someone on the phone who is also clearly working for the knight. This person references the knight directly and talks about how they're gonna open their next Dark World in the church. They talk to Chris about their soul, and then they warn Chris not to let Susie near Des's guitar since it contains one of the shelter codes. And they don't want Susie to get the shelter code because the knight is in the shelter with Undyne right now. Now, we know for a fact that this person is Carol for a couple of reasons. For one, when Susie gets a hold of the guitar, Chris will call this person on the phone again and tell them what happened. And this person will say, "I'll be right there," and hangs up. Not 5 minutes later, Carol waltzes into the house and grabs the guitar from Susie, despite the fact that Noelle said earlier that her mom was going to be working late. After that, Carol will have a brief interaction with Chris where she implies she knows about the soul, just like the mysterious caller. So yeah, obviously the caller is Carol, and this is basically confirmed by Chapter 4's ending, since on the normal route, the mysterious caller will call Chris and remind them of an agreement they made with the caller, and on the Snowgrave route, this person will still call Chris, but you can hear that it's Carol's voice on the phone, and she'll talk a bit about Noelle and the festival. So 100% Carol is the caller and is working with the knight. So that's question 1 answered. Question 2 is, why would Carol work for the knight? I believe it's to find Des, since Carol is clearly obsessed with finding her daughter. She even has this whole ass conspiracy board in her room, which is probably about Des's disappearance. I mean, I guess it could be about the fucking JFK assassination, but come on, it's almost certainly about Des. Especially since Asgore will look at the board and cryptically talk about the reason he lost his job and his family, and how he's gonna open a Dark World to fix it. All of that stuff is definitely related to Des's disappearance. Like, Asgore's divorce was totally caused by Des's disappearance and the conflict between the Holiday and Dreamer family. We know this because in Tenna's flashback, we see Des leave first, followed by Carol, and then Asgore, so you can kind of see the order in which the relationships within this family deteriorated. And it seems like it was all caused by Des disappearing. So yeah, I got off track there. What I'm trying to say is the conspiracy board in Carol's room is almost certainly about Des, and that shows that Carol is still actively looking for her daughter. So is it really that much of a stretch to say that she's working for the knight to find Des? Like maybe they're opening Dark Worlds because Carol thinks Des is lost in a Dark World? I think that's the most likely explanation as to why Carol is working for the knight. And it's like, if Des is the knight, why would Carol work with her to find Des? I guess it's possible that Carol doesn't know Des is the knight and is being deceived, but like, how did Des do this? How did she successfully trick her mother into believing she's not the knight? Wouldn't Carol recognize her daughter's voices and mannerisms? Or does the knight talk in sign language? Or use some sort of Darth Vader-esque voice changer? I don't really get it. And why would Des trick her mom into thinking she's someone else? Why does she need Carol's help so badly? Like, what does she need from Carol that's so important? Is it the shelter? Does she really need access to the shelter that badly? I guess, but doesn't she already know the code to the shelter since it's in her guitar? Why would she need Carol to continue accessing the shelter? Look, I'm not saying that this isn't possible. There could be some context missing that makes this all make sense. But right now, I feel like it's really confusing and convoluted if Des is the knight and Carol is working for her. But yeah, those are the main reasons I don't think Des is the knight that are based on actual evidence in the game, or lack thereof. However, there is one more reason I'd like to talk about that makes me skeptical of the Des Knight theory, and it's the fun kind, a meta reason. I think Des being the knight is too obvious. I mean, it's literally the first thing anyone would think of after seeing the night. You don't need to be a Einstein-level super genius or be super deep into the Deltarune theory brain rot to come to this conclusion. Any casual player who just pays attention to the game will see the knight's antlers and the baseball bat and think, oh, the knight must be a reindeer like Noelle. Wait, doesn't Noelle have a missing sister who likes baseball or something? She's probably the knight. I just feel like if Des was the knight, Toby wouldn't make it so obvious. And I know what some of you are saying. You're basically saying that Des can't be the knight because there's too much evidence against her. That's a completely ridiculous argument. And look, I get it. But that's not what I'm saying. First of all, I think a lot of the evidence against Des is pretty shaky, but I do agree that it's there intentionally. I definitely don't think these details are random or meaningless or coincidental. They do have a greater purpose and are trying to reveal something about the narrative. I just think this information is being framed in a way to mislead people into thinking Des is the knight, when, as more games release, a lot of the evidence will be recontextualized to mean something completely different. I think the real purpose of this information is to tell us more about either Des as a character or the knight as a character, not that they're the same person. And I know a lot of people think Toby wouldn't do something like this. Oh, he wouldn't try so hard to mislead the audience like this. Toby Fox isn't fucking Scott Cawthon. And I agree that Toby's image as this trickster type character has been largely exaggerated online. You know, the tricky Tony fallacy is real. But to say that Toby wouldn't do something like this and it isn't in his writing style is simply untrue. Toby purposely misleads the audience in both Undertale and Deltarune all the time. He also adds all this setup to make the game seem like they're gonna follow a predictable formula, only to subvert our expectations later. You know, he just makes unpredictable stories. Just look at the fate of all of the pattern-based Deltarune theories like chess theory or reverse soul theory. Or hell, just look at all the secret boss theories that relied on the idea that all of the secret bosses would be like Javelin Spamton. Toby just likes making unpredictable games that don't follow a set formula and also subverting common RPG tropes. I agree that he isn't constantly feeding the audience false and misleading information that doesn't really mean anything, like Scott Cawthon. But he does sometimes like to frame important information in a way so that the audience gets a false impression of a situation. The information is still important to the story, it just doesn't mean what we think it means. And I think the most famous example of this is at the beginning of Undertale, where we're shown a scene of a child climbing up Mount Ebit and falling into the underground, and then we're asked to name this fallen child, and most people name them after themselves. Then the screen fades to white, and we take control of a child who's just fallen into the underground. This child looks and dresses identically to the person we just saw fall down in the opening scene, and when we open the menu, we see our name next to our stats. So after seeing all of this information, any reasonable person would come to the conclusion that the person we're controlling right now is the same person we just named and saw fall down into the underground. You know, it's the classic silent protagonist trope. We assume that this character is just a blank slate that we're supposed to project our identity onto. And this belief is further confirmed by the fact that we're having all these flashbacks from the perspective of the fallen human we named, both when we die and have near-death experiences, and none of the characters in the game call you by your actual name, they just call you the human. It's only towards the end of the game that you realize the person you named was the first fallen human, not your character. And it makes for a really good plot twist, since you know it plays on audience expectations and common RPG tropes, and a little bit of trickery and false information in order to subvert our expectations. So you can't really say that Toby wouldn't feed the audience misleading information to set up a huge plot twist in the end, because he does it all the time. Especially if we're going off of that last example, where we inexplicably have flashbacks from the perspective of the first fallen human. You gotta admit that's pretty misleading and very confusing, and I don't think it's ever been fully explained how that works. So the idea that Toby wouldn't make Des a red herring and we're just overthinking things isn't true. Objection, facts not in evidence. I think y'all are severely underthinking things, taking things at face value, and completely ignoring the possibility that we're being misled. I mean, this is the freaking Roaring Knight we're talking about here. Do you really think their identity is gonna be revealed in chapter 3 of 7? Part of the fun of these whodunit mysteries like the Knight's Identity is, well, not knowing who done it. It's about collecting clues and sorting through misdirections and red herrings. It's about the twists and turns a story takes as the audience tries to figure out who did it. And when the big bad's identity is finally revealed, it's supposed to be shocking and you're supposed to be like, I can't believe it's them! Oh my god, how could I have missed all the signs? Blah blah blah. And you know, with all compelling mysteries and plot twists, there's usually some hints sprinkled in that foreshadow the reveal. So some players will figure out the twist before it happens, but hopefully most players won't. And even if the thought did cross their mind and they did consider a specific candidate, they'll either dismiss their thoughts entirely or just be very unsure of them since there are other compelling suspects. Regardless, most people will be completely fooled, and the ones that do figure out the twist beforehand will feel rewarded, like they've outsmarted the author by figuring out the twist before they're supposed to. And I just don't feel like there's anything complicated or impressive about figuring out that Des is the Knight, since any casual player would probably think that at first glance. So any future reveal that involves Des being the Knight would just be underwhelming, because the average player is gonna be like, oh, Des is the Knight? Well duh, I figured that out like 5 years ago. It's like super obvious. I just feel like the game is trying a little too hard to convince you Des is the Knight. And look, I've heard some people say, well, maybe Toby doesn't think the Knight's identity is that important, and there's something bigger than who's beneath the mask. So, you know, he's not really prioritizing having this big, shocking reveal. But I'm sorry, the fact that there were literally hundreds of Deltarune Knight theories on YouTube alone proves that the Knight's identity is an incredibly important part of the story, at least from the perspective of the average player. Plus, the game is constantly, edging us about the Knight's identity and, teasing a reveal. You're even given an opportunity to think about the Knight in Chapter 4, and the narration describes the Knight slowly taking off their helmet to reveal who they truly are, before Chris quickly thinks of something else and stops us from finding out who they are. So the Knight's identity is very important to the story, and is clearly being set up as this huge mystery that is bound to have a big reveal later on. And the only way for that reveal to be impactful is if the audience didn't see it coming, which just wouldn't be true if Des is the Knight. Look, I completely acknowledge the possibility Des is the Knight, and I'm sure a competent writer like Toby could make a reveal like that work. But I ask you, Des truthers, is it not at all possible Des is just a red herring? Kind of like how Briss was a red herring in Chapter 2. Look, fool me once, shame on you. But fool me twice? Shame on me. I just see this as Chris Knight all over again, and I'm just not gonna fall for it. And look, I know what some of you are asking right now. If Des isn't the Knight, who is? And the truth is, I don't know. I highly doubt it's Carol for multiple reasons. For one, I also think it's a little too obvious. There's also the timeline inconsistency where she was in the kitchen disciplining Noelle when the Knight was supposedly in the church dark world. In order for this to work, it means that after Chris and Susie left her house, she ran over to the church just in time to confront them in the dark world, which is a little unbelievable, especially when she would have to not run fast enough for Chris and Susie to notice she's there. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's clear that Carol is deeply involved in the Knight's plan. She's the mastermind of the whole thing. And the katana in her bedroom does look very similar to the Knight's weapon, but I don't think Carol is the Knight. I honestly don't know who the Knight could be. I mean, who else has antlers, knows Carol personally, has access to the katana in her bedroom, would want to look for Des, and isn't a super obvious candidate? I have no idea. Alrighty then, this is the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you didn't enjoy it, make sure to leave a dislike and a death threat in the comments below. Thank you to my wonderful members, Mira Jaded, Ritalin, Silly Willy Billy Silly, Grey Leno, Shoshi, Frenchinator, Wolfish Mass, Pokio, Ronan Faria, Noha, Ashley, Nuzrit, Dio Nasty, Ruin Hornet, and Charlotte. Thank you to my wonderful patrons, Irrelevant, Breakfield, Awesome GN, Jay Blued, Dark Buddhist, Malzeno Gaming, Gusto Frasian, Shoshi, and the GOAT, Noha. And finally, thank you for watching my video. Bye-bye.